to another Just 5 Mins. And on today's episode, I've got a special guest, a good friend of mine, Tim Abel, who has actually appeared on this podcast in the past. But this one is about outside-in testing, and it really stemmed from a great podcast that Tim did really late at night. So I hats off to him for carrying on and working at whatever hour it was in, the late evening, early morning, no doubt. But it's it was a great podcast, sorry. So it prompted me to ask Tim, I've tried to trim things down to about 3 questions. So without further ado, we'll go over to the recorded podcast, and apologies in advance if the levels aren't brilliant. I'm a bit of a novice when it comes to audio production. So anyway, without further ado, again, let's jump into that recorded session. Okay, my good friend Tim.
Hello.
Just because it's 5 minutes, I've got to talk really quick, but this is based on a podcast that I'm going to link to that Tim inspired me about testing. So, Tim, the first question is, the grammar's really bad, by the way. I'm just going to add that right now. It was really interesting because I've only, like I've just mentioned in the pre-chat, really I've only done a bit of TDD, and I've really sort of like just been latched into things where other people have been using certain tools or certain ideas, and I've never really gone for the whole testing ethos as a overview, as an overall thing. So what I was going to, the first question is how you evolved in your own testing journey. Like, right. Did you start with TDD and end to end or E to E?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm banging this drum is because I came across testing as TDD, like unit testing, and thought, oh, this is cool. Cargo culted that for a while and then never quite got the results. And it's quite recently that I've been working with some people who really get the outside in, like user perspective testing. And it's like, oh my God, why don't we talk about this more as an industry? So yeah, the podcast you mentioned is really a much longer version of, we need to turn our perspective upside down and start thinking from the user's perspective about testing, and not from the engineers testing all the components. But yeah, it's been a long journey. I mean, I've been coding professionally for 23 years, just about. And yeah, a bit late to this party, but hey, let's bang the drum anyway, right?
Hey, well, do you know what? You just hit the phrase that I was trying to remember, was the outside in. I know it's maybe a trivial phrase to actually say, but that was it. I think that was the listening to your podcast that sort of hit me. Was because it was so about, let's test this little bit of function, let's test this little bit here, let's test, and all that is all very, good and relative to what you need to do. But I think it was that outside in, and then the conversation, which again is in your podcast for the people who want to listen to the fuller version of that, which is well worth the listen. So thank you. Yeah. And it really, I suppose that brings me on to the second point, was the challenges did you face about with the testing infrastructure, like the tools of choice? Because again, if it's anything like myself, and I'm like a little bit, shiny, another shiny bit, a bit more shiny. But what were those sort of challenges that you found? Was it the tools that could be a barrier, or was it just buy-in from the team, as it were?
Yeah, no, the tools is an interesting point, because to do the outside-in testing, it is harder than doing it unit test, and the realization that I hit on when I was thinking about this as a topic is that if you don't have a fundamental belief that it's really important that you look at your behavior of your system from the outside and make sure that works, and you're more kind of cargo culting the testing thing, then if you got I could unit test this, or I could integration test that, if there's more friction because the tooling is harder or incomplete on the integration testing side, it's easy to just retreat into the unit testing side. So, for example, if you want to test the API service of a microservice, you need some kind of test rig. you might have to buy some off-the-shelf software. Like, where are you going to run it? It's really, do you have some kind of self-hosting thing? Microsoft have added what they confusingly call integration testing, where the test can self-host your API using a web application factory, which is really good. And they've done a lot of the work for you there. But there's always some yak, like, oh, I need a database or a mocked out database, or if it's got some kind of visual front end, you're into the world of browser automation and what have you, and let alone if you go to like full system testing across multiple services. So yeah, there's lots of frictions on that side, and compare it to unit testing, where it's a lot more like, you pull down N unit or X unit or whatever your language provides, you isolate your class or your component, and you test your inputs and outputs, and there's like so little friction there. It seems higher value, but the mindset thing of, but does that stop it breaking for your users, seems to be the missing belief. That means that people then just don't try and get, like, individuals and teams don't then try and get over that friction. So for me, the foundation is like, why are we doing this? What are the beliefs? And then once you've got that in place, you're like, oh, okay, we'll put the work in, and you can justify the work. You can get it onto your backlog. You can work with the technical architects, the principals, the team leads to be like, we don't want to ship a broken system, so we're going to have to do this work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's interesting, actually, because one thing I hadn't even, well, not recently anyway, is things like, as you say, even mocking up a database, like because there are, tools on the market that help you do that, and I'm sure there's a plethora of them, actually. But I didn't even think about that. But yeah, like you said, you've got to, and you've got to sort of adopt what, like you said, the least friction, really. Otherwise, you're just going to go back into, oh, well, I can just unit test at least, or something like that. So, yeah, wow. Cool. And the third one, because it is meant to be just 5 minutes, but as we know, it tends to drag on a bit, doesn't it? Do you know what? Actually, as a quick aside, I'm reading something about, I can't remember the name, but it's a book about being succinct, ultimately. And the reason I'm reading that is because exactly what's happening right now.
Is it a very long book?
Yeah, no, actually, there you go. It's actually a quite brief sort of thing about, and I'm thinking, well, that's where AI is going to help me, isn't it? It'll just rewrite a succinct version of whatever I ramble about. So, but anyway, but the third thing, I know it's all, obviously, because it's, let's face it, it's crammed into round about 5 minutes. So these are all really large subjects in themselves. But the third one and the final one was for someone like me that's got, let's face it, I'm not a real developer anymore. Honestly, I'm not. And I don't think I ever was, actually, to be honest. But
no, you definitely were. I've seen it.
No, well, that's very kind. But honestly, I think back at some of the stuff I did and was like, oh, dear. Did I really do that? But anyway, I suppose everybody does,
yeah,
though, don't
they?
Yeah. In fact, I've been, again, rambling here, but good old, and I forgot his name, the Imposter Handbook guy, Rob Connery, I think his name is. And it's a book that he did years ago, but he's got like a second edition about, about exactly that you never feel like you're good enough and all that. But at the same time, the big thing that I got from you, Tim, and that call, and this is what leads me on to the third and final question, I promise, is you don't, if you're just working, even in a small team, like 2 or 3 people, you don't necessarily have the exposure that you've had in your projects. And also, if I'm okay saying, you contract as a developer, team lead, architect, etc. So you're not in just one company for a chunk of time, where, let's face it, it can go quite stale. So you've had that benefit of having lots of contracts in different organisations. So the third and final, I'll finally get there, is someone like me that I've got an appetite to want to do the right thing. Now, even if that's writing a to-do app, which is a bit extreme, isn't it, for something small like that? But I did actually contemplate using aspire to do a microservice version of a to-do app just to get some learning, which is way overkill. But for someone like me, what type of tools? I know a little bit about TDD, and I think I've done some NUnit stuff and XUnit. I think they were the two primary things. But obviously, and that's based on the fact that I use Visual Studio because I'm a Luddite. I haven't quite migrated to Rider and all the other lovely things out there, or even different languages. So are there some building blocks that you would recommend? Or is that just too wide a question?
No, not at all. So you mentioned XUnit and NUnit and what have you, and they're basically test runners. They don't really care what level you're testing at. So those are still valuable tools. So the last time that I did this outside in thing for a microservice, it was still XUnit running the tests and giving you the test results. It's just that the setup and code is composing much more of it together. Other than that, what I would say beyond the mindset stuff is think about who the customers or users are of your thing that you're creating and how they interact with it, and just try and get as close as you can to a realistic interaction. So I've got a command line application called Gitopolis that's on GitHub. It's open source, and I've applied it to that. So the integration tests, like the outside in tests for that, they literally run the binary and pump standard input, i.e. what you would type, and standard output in and out of the test rig, and check some stuff on disk. So the tests are able to observe the behavior of the completely built binary from that perspective. And in terms of like tooling, you basically have to look at what your surface area is. Is it an API? Is it a command line app? Is it, a web browser thing? And then in the ecosystem that you're in, hunt around for tools that allow you to interact as if you were a user, and just see how close you can get to a user before you start pushing down the test pyramid into kind of more component and unit testing. So that's where I would start.
Yeah, brilliant, because that's really cool, because I didn't realise you still use things like NUnit, XUnit to, like you said, it's about how you configure and what it's actually going to do. And I think
there is one exception I've seen for API, which is a team using Postman to drive all the tests, because I don't know if you've used Postman, but it allows you to interact with an API by sending and receiving HTTP requests. You can build libraries, but also it's got a reasonable amount of automation in there, and the team I work with built a pretty complicated test rig out of that, so there wasn't any .NET code, and it was a mixed blessing, because on the one hand, it's much more point and click. It's much more easy to just very quickly iterate on it. On the other hand, when it becomes complicated, it becomes much more unwieldy than, a normal .NET thing. So your mileage may vary.
Really good point, because I with my day job, we deal with a lot of APIs, and Postman's always there.
It is.
But to be honest, for the most part, for a long, long time, I just used it like everybody else, get post, do that. And then I realised, I don't know what version it was, but they started to do where you could take the API spec and then simply say, create a mock of that, which was really cool. But the only other experience I've had in there actually is, because I think they must use something like Node.js or something around the back, isn't it, or JavaScript or something, because it's I had to do something with, I think it was NetSuite, to do the authentication or something. But that's a really good point, actually, is because I think that's the point. I think from your perspective is you looking up, if you like, at the grand scenario of all this testing, you think there's maybe some really expensive tools or a plethora of all these tools that you need to know. And no, you like you said, it's the usual concept, isn't it? Keep it simple. And I think the big thing that I'm taking away is the outside in and as close to that user experience to feed in, which I think that's the big thing I'm getting from this, is that, not to get overwhelmed with all the tooling, because, let's face
and also
it.
not thinking that someone else has got some magic that you don't have. Like all the teams that I've seen that have tackled it, they just use the programming and testing stuff that's around, and it's more about the mindset and about the direction you attack it from.
Brilliant. That's it, isn't it? That's the key. That is brilliant. Wow. Well, I don't know if this is actually going to be 5 minutes, and I know, yeah, I know, but there's much deeper sort of aspects to all of these points and lots more. But as I'll absolutely do is put the link to your podcast.
Software should be free, yeah.
Yeah, software should be free, definitely. But it was a really, like I said before in the pre-chat, it was a really interesting thing because it seemed to touch the bit about the outside in, the fact that you're not just trying to be a technical testing scenario here. It's about that. So it was a really, like I say, it really prompted me to try to get in touch and have this chat with you. So thank you very much, Tim.
No, you're most welcome. Thanks for having me.
I'll put the links in the show notes. Thank you.